So it was something, the complexity that African literature is not something you can just say is the same, but when they come together, there's a certain richness in so many diversities that form this very literature. So it was very interesting. And the writers themselves, we use different, there are different theories, different approaches that enriched the work. It's not just one person writing or two people. And we were able to, we allowed the scholars to use approaches they found we most engaging in unraveling the complexities of migration and this new diaspora. And that's part of the richness of the work, which we enjoy as writers and scholars.
And maybe my a follow-up question before we go into the presentation is, how much translation do you see happening between Africans on the continent, in the diaspora, translating across the colonial languages and also across the languages that are spoken on the continent?
There's a lot of translation going on. You will see someone like Ngugi has, in fact, has engaged in this. Ngugi and some other writers have been working on translation that ideally, in an ideal situation, Africans ought to write in their own languages. But if they chose to write in these former colonial languages, then they have to be translation. In fact, there was a meeting in Asmara, in Eritrea, a long time ago. That's about 2004, so, in which we dealt with this issue of translation, that African creative works need to be translated for other Africans to read. So the effort is going on, but it's not as much as one we expect. There are European scholars, African scholars, translating works from English to French, from French to English. So a lot of translation is going on, but I don't think we've reached a stage where we can say that what is written in those languages is available to almost everybody to read. In fact, it's getting more difficult. There was a time when the publishers, when we had all these Heinemann, Longman publishing books in Africa, and it was easy to read African literature just like that. But with those publishers leaving Africa, maybe because of economic reasons, it's more difficult now. And if these works are not available, then the translation becomes difficult. So there's some translation going on, but we've not reached a stage where we can say, yes, we've reached a stage that Africans can read whatever book they want in a language they can read and write on.
And for those who are joining us, we are listening to Professors Losambe and Ojaide, who are editors of the Routledge Handbook of the New African Diasporic Literature. And the conversation is taking place as part of the Africa Migration Report Poetry Anthology series. And we now go to your presentation, if it is okay with you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I will start the presentation talking about the beginning of the new African diasporic literature and talk about the first wave. My colleague will pick on from the second wave. And I will just read on what we have here. The new African diaspora was a work put together by Isidore Kwehu and Nkiru Nzeku, in which they conceptually brought to prominence the notion of the new African diaspora, which has been previously debated at meetings by Kosa and others before them. So Okwehu makes an important temporospatial distinction between the old pre-colonial and the new post-colonial African diaspora. And in fact, he writes that in the latter, the slave trade had been abolished and replaced by the establishment of Western European colonization over African nations and the exploitation of their natural resources. Africans of the pre-colonial diaspora had been mostly forced out of their societies into bondage, so they had no choice in their relocation to the Western world. So the old pre-colonial diaspora, African diaspora, and the new post-colonial African diaspora. After Isidore Kweho had written that book, Ali Mazrui also, gazing from the angle of power relations, further characterizes the old diaspora as the diaspora of enslavement, and the new diaspora, the diaspora of imperialism. Two diasporas. So in addition to Isidore Kweho, Ali Mazrui, Deleuze also talks about the new and the old African diaspora, following the same protopic demarcation and taking into account cultural diversity in diaspora formation. Paul Zeleza has also distinguished between what he calls the historic diasporas, that's the old diaspora, and the contemporary diaspora, that's the new diaspora. With regard to the contemporary diasporas, he has further identified three main characteristic waves: the diasporas of colonization, decolonization, and structural adjustment. And this is what he writes. The diasporas of colonization would include the students who went to study abroad and stayed, seamen who became settlers, and many others who could migrate and become citizens according to the prevailing immigration regimes in the host countries. The diasporas of decolonization include, besides the so-called indigenous Africans, European and Asian settlers who relocated overseas during the struggles for independence and immediately after. The diasporas of structural adjustment have been formed since the 1980s out of the migrations engendered by economic, political, and social crises and the destabilization of structural adjustment programs. The national elites, traders, refugees, and students. So the new diaspora, which we are concerned with, has three waves: the colonial wave, the colonization wave, and the structural adjustment. So you can see political and economic type of causes. So in this volume, in the book itself, the Routledge Handbook of the New African Diaspora, where we follow the what Zeleza has said, the waves he has demarcated in literature. In this volume, we use the label, the New African Diaspora, as it is constituted by the three main waves described above, and I agree with Zeleza that a precondition for the transition from a migrant into a diasporan to a diasporan is prolonged settlement, followed by permanent resettlement in a new home country. So that's one of the things we're doing. Migration per se makes somebody a diasporan, or it has to be a permanent settlement. But we feel as if migration is a process, while the diasporan is already settled, permanent settlement. The Routledge Handbook of the New African Diaspora Literature is comprehensive. It's a comprehensive companion that introduces students, scholars, and general readers of world literature to the transnational and multivocal writings of immigrant African authors produced in Europe, North America, and elsewhere in the world. The writings are discussed in the three major aesthetic paradigms that we label as the Sankofan wave, that's from late 1960s to 1980s, the Janusian wave, 1990s to the 2020s, and the offshoots of the new Arrivants, that's those born or have grown up outside Africa. So those three ways, we've tried to give it a timeline for the three, the Sankofan, the Janusian, and the offshoots of the Arrivants. Let me just talk briefly, just read about the Sankofan wave. The Sankofan wave includes prominent writers like Abdulrazak Gona, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Kiorapse Ngosisile, Dennis Brutus, Zowikom, Christopher Hope, Buchi Emecheta, Tidokwepo, Ben Okri, Niyo Sundari, Tanure Ojaide, Tess Onweme, Silcheni Koka, Jack Mapanje, Emmanuel Dongala, Ngandu Kashama, and a host of others. The Sankofan bird, this Akan folklore, forward while gazing backward, and has become a symbol of connection, reconnection, and reconciliation of African diasporic subjects with the continent. Like the mythical Akan Sankofa bird, this first wave of the new African diasporic writers mostly draw their creative inspiration in terms of themes and aesthetics from bountiful cultural storehouses of their respective originary ethnic African locations. This group of modern African writers experienced firsthand their indigenous African cultures from colonialism to political independence of their respective countries. These are writers who had already established themselves before coming to the global north. These decades of emigration from Africa coincide with the period of apartheid in South Africa, military coups, and post-independence civil wars and unrest, IMF economic measures of austerity, which devastated African economies, economic and social lifestyles, and massive corruption in the affairs of state. Thus, while some were forced out of Africa into exile, and this is very important, like the examples like Ngosisile, Dennis Brutus, Jack Mapanje, and Frank Chipasula, the other members of this group of African diasporic writers left following instability, a crunching economic situation in the continent, and other personal reasons. One can only posit from the intimate African home experience that they are Sankofan as they simultaneously look backward even as they move forward. Memory of Africa has a consistent presence in their work. There's always something about Africa they look back to. The socio-political, economic, and cultural states of the new nation are often the focus of these writers. As pointed out by Abiola Ireli, African historical experience serves as a constant reference for the African imagination because through colonialism and neocolonialism, the West has cast Africa as the other in order to enforce its self-affirmation as the unique source of human and spiritual values. This group, what's very consistent with them is that they look back to Africa for aesthetic and thematic considerations. And there's a lot of use of folklore. They use a lot of folklore. These are people who grew up in Africa. They were writing in Africa. They got established. Most of them were known, and they came to Africa. And the example of Ngugi and most of the others is the use of folklore, like Ngugi. Even when in diaspora, he makes use of a lot of folklore, Gikuyu folklore in The Wizard of the Crow and The Perfect Nine, focusing on the plight of the post-colonial nations they left behind. Writers like Ngugi often use folklore and local myths to satirize poor national leadership while conscientizing the multitudes for revolutionary actions. In fiction and poetry in particular, the use of oral literary resources gives the new diasporic literary works a cultural identity. And examples of poets are here, poets who use African folklore and the literary forms. I think, concluding this section, we have a writer who tries to bring the old diaspora and the new diaspora together. And that's Isidore Pueblo, who in his Call Me By My Rightful Name shows that that the old diaspora can unite with the new diaspora in a novel in which the protagonist, an African American, a member of the old diaspora, using language, tries to trace his origin in Africa, in the Yoruba area. So there's a connection. There could be a connection even in the new diaspora with the old diaspora. And so basically, that's how the new African diasporic literature is defined. And I've tried to explain, to describe the first wave, through the Sankofan bird that looks behind while moving forward. So my colleague, Professor Losambe, will talk about the Janusian wave and the offshoots, and then we can go on with the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Tanure. So I'm taking over now from the Janusian wave. The Janusian wave authors, also called Afropolitans, occupy a third space, and now we have borrowed there Homi Bhabha's concept of a third word, which also I have elaborated on in some of my previous writings. Like the two-faced Roman god of a transition, openness, connection, and the creative articulation of the past and the present for progressive future, they simultaneously cast a critical gaze upon three life worlds: the African societies they originate from, the Western world they presently live in, and the humanistic or globalist consciousness they project. The neo-humanism, or the transnational consciousness articulated in the writings of these new diasporic authors, reflects what Abiola Ilele's idea of African literature as a conjunction of creative impulses refracting local and the global issues of our time. Writers like Chimamanda Adichie, Chris Abani, Sefi Atta, Taye Selassie, Helen Habila, Noviole, Bulawayo, Gabiba Badrum, Leila Abolela, Imbolo Mbwe, Alain Mambaku, Frida Ekoto, Patrice Nganga, Abdurrahman Waberi, Chisungu Achisungu, Nanega, Meslekia, all are unified in the articulation of a transnational post-colonial conjunctive consciousness, which promotes what Spivak calls a collective rearrangement of desires, that being a conditional possibility of a convivial humanity, as suggested by Paul Giroy. Their writings draw their effectiveness and the compelling vitality from the author's masterful combination of aspects of what Abiola Ilele has called aesthetic traditionalism which is made up of cultural interpolation and metonymic gap. And then the neorealism, which combines the grotesque, the magical, the metonymic, the metaphoric, and the shifting points of view in an episodic narrative structure, and the neo-humanistic aesthetic, which enlists analepsis, textual collage, social media, and the cyberspace, especially the blogosphere, as important narrative techniques. This sophisticated, complex arsenal of narrative techniques makes the writings of this generation transformative as they bring to the surface globally repressed, anachronistic, and melancholic attitudes about class, race, gender, sexuality, disability, religion, nationality, ethnicity, migrancy, transnational identities, and environment. The art is, to a certain extent, akin to the neo-poetics, which, to quote Rancière, quote, frames a new hermeneutics taking upon itself the task of making society conscious of its own secret by leaving the noisy stage of political claims and the doctrines and delving into the depth of the social to disclose the enigmas and the fantasies hidden in the intimate realities of everyday life, end quote. Chris Abani has cogently described the creative project of this generation of the new African diasporic writers as transnational and liberated from the cultural nationalism found in the writings of the early generations of African writers. In an interview with Yogita Goyal, Abani has stated that, quote, his generation is doing exciting work, and I say about my work, it is in many ways post-national and the global, not only in its reach, but in its attempt to locate a very specific African sensibility without attempting to limit it with certain kinds of arguments about essentiality and so forth, end quote. Whether writing in English, French, or other European languages, many new African diasporic writers, including Adichie, Oyeyemi, Teju Cole, Taile, Selassie, Imbolo, Boye, all those I mentioned above, and many others, have time again articulated this sense of what I have called transnational post-colonial conjunctive consciousness in various interviews about their lives and in their respective creative projects. Most of them have refused to be narrowly zoned and labeled African writers. For example, when asked the question whether she would describe herself and her writing as African, in an interview with Aminata Forna, Adichie responds, I quote, being labeled an African writer is something I'm uncomfortable with, but also proud of. Proud because it's a heritage that I embrace, uncomfortable because it is a loaded term and often one that is given to you by somebody else. If it didn't come with baggage, then it will be fine, but it does, and because of that, there is some discomfort, end quote. In the same interview, Hélène Oyeyemi also expresses the same discomfort, stating that, I quote, that the label African writer can pigeonhole you because when you walk into bookshops, you often see a lot of great Nigerian or African writers being put into categories such as Black interest or African interest. That is annoying, according to her, end quote. As Goyala has remarked, Abani has resisted various labels of a Igbo writer, a British writer, a Los Angeles writer, Black writer, African writer, or a Nigerian writer. In an interview with Claire Chambers, Leila Abulela, the Sudanese writer, has also resisted being narrowly defined by one cultural site, stating that there are three things that together make up my identity: Sudan, Egypt, and Britain. Ahmed Wahala is therefore right when he points out that the transnational consciousness that informs Abulela's creative writing emanates from her conjunctive diasporic positioning. And in a quote, I quote him here, daughter of an Egyptian mother and a Sudanese father, and at the same time brought up at a westernized environment of private American school, Abulela has always been tuned cultural negotiations across heterogeneous geographies, ethnicities, and the languages in Cairo, Khartoum, Jakarta, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, London, and Aberdeen. End of quote. And here we must emphasize that instead of using the label Afropolitan to describe those writers, we have preferred to use Janusian. And the Janusian, and this is because the label Afropolitanism is premised on the concept of cosmopolitanism, which from the Greek, certainly, it indicates it is more emphasizing the culture conflict that always emerges, and then the ability or the attitude, the tendency of a cosmopolitan subject to adjust or adapt. But here, when considered that way, I think we thought that then it diminishes, it undermines the agency, interventionist agency of those writers, and so that those writers in entering into that space that then refuses to be, located totally, they then they are able to make serious interventions then, or their works, transformative intervention on the pitfalls of the society in which, Western society in which they live, but also the African society that each one of them comes from. And in that way, they then are projecting constantly the possibility of a convivial humanity where difference then is not tolerated, but accepted, and that, whether you are in America, you are in Britain, coming from Nigeria, I don't need necessarily to speak like a British. I can bring my English from Nigeria or French from the Congo, and then express myself in that language that then has I have now appropriated and am a creative in it. And so that intervention then, what they are doing is almost like introducing a corrective narrative that then negates that emphasis on assimilationist drives, but then very much emphasizing like Janusian, that look, we belong to to the world, and this world, because of colonial encounters, the Europeans or Americans should know that they went to Africa, created a certain values, and as Africa encountered African values there, and we had hybrid formations. And so coming to France, coming to, as Fatou Diom will say, you, the French people, we are stuck with you because you came into our countries and stole all our riches, and they came here and developed yourself, and then now you see us as outsiders. What that which enable you to our resources that enable you to create, then you are blinded to those realities. And so this is how the sense of agency that we felt the Janusian figure really becomes more descriptive of those, rather than Afropolitanism, which then is more of adapting and being cosmopolitan city dweller, in contrast to others. And so that is how. Now another wave, the last wave, the third one, is what we call the offshoots of the new Arrivants. And then the term Arrivants included in our description of the third wave of the new African diasporic writers is borrowed from Kamau Braithwaite's poetic trilogy entitled The Arrivants. It was published in 1988, and it depicts lived experiences of the early members of the African historical diaspora, their environment, and their expressive popular culture, in this case, spirituals, jazz, folk music, and oral tales, in a new world. As depicted in the poems that comprise the trilogy, the enslaved African Arrivants were carriers and the makers of historical and imbricated cultural memories that they bequeathed to their offshoots and subsequent generations. With regard to the new African diasporic arrivants, their offshoots draw inspiration for their creative project, not only from the artistic corpus of members of the historical and the new diaspora, but also from the works of other contemporary authors in world literature. Thus, the third wave that we call the offshoots of the new arrivants comprises those born or who grew up in the diasporic spaces, such as Africa, and they mostly draw their aesthetic and thematic inspirations from Western authors and literary traditions, including African American and Caribbean literatures. As Celeza has stated, unlike their parents, those offshoots of the new arrivants are fully socialized into the experiences and identities of the historical or the historic diaspora, end quote. They invoke Black history into the quotidian to decenter the West from within, as they affirm the inevitable connectivity that the initial encounters between the West and the rest of the world sedimented. Legitimately claiming space within English, American, French, Portuguese, and other European literary traditions, they give expression to the historically and the presently marginalized Black subjects. Unlike the Janusian wave diasporic writers discussed above, these writers connect with and experience Africa through physical visits, archival research, and oral stories that they often produce as documentaries or integrate into their fictional narratives, drama, and poetry. Writers in this new diasporic category include Nigerian British poet and novelist Bernardine Evaristo, Sierra Leonean British novelist Aminata Forna, Nigerian British novelist Helen Oyeyemi, Nigerian British poet and playwright Imwa Elams, Somali British poet Walsa Shire, Ghanaian British novelist Taye Selassie, Nigerian American novelist and photographer Teju Cole, Ghanaian American novelist Ya Yassi, Senegalese French novelist Marine Ndiaye, Angolan Portuguese novelist Yara Monteiro, Angolan Portuguese novelist Jamilia de Almeida, the Cape Verdean novelist Joaquin Arena, and the Nigerian, Jamaican, South African novelist Yewande Omotosho. And so this handbook is unique both in its scholarly content and scope, as it covers all the genres. And so instead of reductively assimilating the new diasporic literature influenced by multiple aesthetic sensibilities into the continental concept of African literature, as other guides have done, and here we refer to other companions, such as the one written by Olagoke George, published by Blackwell in 2021, and the Morade Umadejimobi and the Kali Kotit's volume published by Routledge. We regard it as a major part of the distinct larger African diasporic literary tradition, written by well-established and emerging scholars of African and diasporic literatures from across the world. The chapters cover the works of well-known and not so well-known Anglophone, Francophone, and Lusophone writers from different theoretical positions, from positionalities and critical approaches. In so doing, the chapters point out the unique, innovative artistic qualities of this major subgenre of African literature. The focus on the diasporic consciousness of the writers and their works puts this handbook on a different pedestal from others that solely emphasize migration, which is more of a process than the community of settled African people involved in the dynamic acts of living outside Africa reflected in the diasporic writings. And so we have assembled the essays according to the different waves of African immigrants into the diaspora. As exemplified earlier, the first wave of Sankofan immigrant writers were born and raised in Africa, and most of them attained literary renown in their respective genres before they left Africa. We observe those two, so we have the Francophone and Anglophone. And so this is what we did. There are so many, we don't attempt to summarize the chapters. There are 46 chapters, but this is a gist of what is contained in the essays discussed in the volume. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And also listening to you, and also looking at the introductory chapter. One of the terms that appears a lot is consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, maybe can you say more about that?
Yeah, I will publish that, and then Tanure will. So the consciousness is, and that is precisely where you have the difference between a cosmopolitan and a diasporic subject. In other words, a diasporic subject then it takes responsibility with the diasporic space. That space called diaspora enables present to the writer that the possibility of engaging in a dystopian way with the concept of the West as a place, as a place, or with the streets full of gold, as some of the Sullivan will put it, right? But it is presenting the realities after experiencing those realities, and looking at, gazing at the African societies they come from, and where we are now, the temporality that then makes it possible for us to be here, and they take a conscious of their existence within that space, but also conscious of their responsibility as a subject. And so in that consciousness then is the taking of a responsibility of that space for the intervention on the creation of a new world order where diversity is acceptable in all respects: race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, and others. So that way, the writer then deploys himself as an educator, kind as it were. It is not like you are adjusting and then you are leaving yourself, but you take into consideration. It's almost like what we are familiar with the Frantz Fanon, as he said that each generation, history bequeaths a certain responsibility for each generation. You can either betray it or act, seize it and act to transform, to mark the world. But this is what the Janusian writer then, what they are trying to accomplish there. And so that when we read Americana, for instance, by Adichie, you see that the kind of America that is presented there, she, in a way, like, in a very authoritative way, is able to reveal to us the pitfalls of American society, that then the society that finds itself incapable of accepting others into that space as they are. And you have either to conform as an American or do this. And the gazing to Nigeria is able to see also that, look, Nigeria is still almost like the colonized mentality is still there. The situation where the person will prefer a French school, to send the children to, when you have a Nigerian, languages well developed there and things like that. And so you also prefer fair skin to be a symbol of beauty within Nigeria, or will prefer a white man to come and the chair and the director could be the director of a company, so that the company can have can attract the people. You see, all those it's a part of the colonial mentality that makes it, that also hinders that freedom, that almost like still imprisons our mentality, even in assessment of our own personalities. So that's the consciousness.
Yeah, okay. there's not much much more to add to it, but I think there's a certain acceptance of the new space in which you live, a certain, and within the new space, there's a sort of you have a responsibility to the new state in which you live. You're influenced by this. You work there, you make a living there, which makes it very different from just going to a place, a visitor, and going away. And once you are part of the system, it then means that you owe a responsibility. You feel it. So it's the way you express the way you feel about the new location. The new location is important. The way you feel about the system. And even when you look back at Africa, as my colleague has said, it's not quite the same way. It's not quite the same way. If you look at, sometimes we can take there's a book like Chika Onigwe's short stories, and in fact, one of the scholars here is in attendance here. If you look at the way the Igbos who are in that Belgian town, society, community is, the way they behave there is not the way they behave in Nigeria. They behave in Nigeria, or the way they will behave in Nigeria. This notion of survival, they have to survive. Sometimes they have to do things which they know may not be true, may not be morally or ethically right, but to get their papers, to get documentation, to be citizens, to enjoy the rights in that place, they do certain things. See, that's part of the diasporic consciousness, this ability that there's something working in the consciousness to really do things that make you do well in that society. And what you may do there may not be very positive, like those marrying just to get the papers and so forth. So the diasporic consciousness, which we saw in these things, it varies from place to place, depends upon the nation you find yourself in the United States, in France, in Belgium, in Britain, and the way you respond will depend upon the individual character in the work, individual character, and then the society in which you live. Your own response to that society, I think, is very important. That it's not the same. You are living in a new society, which is not your originary, which makes it different. I think that's my addition to that. I think my colleague has explained a lot about it. Yeah.
This conversation is taking place as part of the Africa Migration Report Poetry Anthology series, which we are currently working on. The Poetry Anthology series was inspired by the Africa Migration Report produced by the African Union and IOM, which presents research on African migration and mobility. And while the AU and IOM's report is a formal report, our poetry anthology explores the past, present, and futures of African migration through poetry, prose, and conversations such as these with poets and other writers who are working on the theme of African migration. So on this note, I say thank you and see you again next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. What a wonderful event.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All the best.
Thank
Best
you.
wishes. See you again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.